What's up, everybody? Welcome to Pants's Guide to Shadow Priest in Cataclysm, where the Shadow Orbs are made up and the breakpoints don't matter. That's right, breakpoints don't matter, but I'll talk about that later in the video. Feel free to check out the timestamps below for your desired section, and let's get into it. Alright, first things first, let's talk about talents. Now, there really only is one talent setup for PvE Shadow Priest, and that's what you see on your screen. Now, there are a few points that you can move around, but they really don't matter too much in the grand scheme of things. In the very beginning, in tier 11, when our mana is pretty bad, I would recommend putting 3 out of 3 points into mental agility. But outside of that, just put 2 points into mental agility and bring that final point into inner sanctum, which reduces all spell damage you take by an extra 2%. It's pretty minor, but when you don't need the mana in later phases, this is what you're gonna wanna use. Now, when it comes to glyphs, there's also really only one setup we want to use. Our prime glyphs are going to be Glyph of Shadow Word Death, Glyph of Shadow Word Pain, and Glyph of Mind Flay. Major glyphs would be Glyph of Spirit Tap, Glyph of Inner Fire, Glyph of Fade, and minor glyphs are Glyph of Shadow Fiend, Glyph of Fortitude, Glyph of Levitate. Now, there are other glyphs you want to make sure you have, but you won't be using them on a regular basis. This is really just going to be Glyph of Fear Ward and Glyph of Mass Dispel, but otherwise, with all the other glyphs, you are good to go. Now let's talk about stat weights. Since we have Reforging and Cataclysm, this makes reaching our hit cap a lot easier, which is going to simplify this process. Anyway, our best stat is going to be Intellect. Intellect is just so good since it now gives spell power that it is the best stat for us. After that, for our secondary stats, we want to be hit capped, so making sure we have 1742 hit, I believe. And remember that for Shadow Priest, Spirit now also counts as hit, so it's 1742 as a combination of hit or Spirit, followed by Haste, Mastery, and Crit. We just want to get as much Haste as possible, and then of course followed by Mastery, and Crit is still good, it's just not as good as the other two stats. If you use the add-on Reforge Light to automatically reforge your gear and use the Shadow Priest preset, it will use this stat order in order to reforge your gear. But the thing about stat weights is that they constantly change and evolve with every new piece of gear you get, which means every time you reforge, you are going to have a new stat weights. Now, I'm not saying you should reforge, check your stat weights, reforge, check your stat weights, but just make sure that you're double checking any reforges that get done to make sure that you have the most optimal setup. And the way you check for the most optimal setup is by simming. If you're not familiar with the sim, I highly recommend you start using it. There are so many questions that people ask that can be easily answered by using the sim. In terms of what gem should I use? What enchant should I use? What's the best off piece for this tier set? Like, there are so many answers that are readily available to you if you just use the sim. You can join my Discord or the Shadow Priest Discord if you have any questions specifically on how to use the sim, but I would highly recommend that you just dive in and just play around and see what you find on your own. Now, when it comes to your phase bis, you can use the preset on the sim to already find it pre-loaded. You just click the button here, load the gear, and you can see how it sims. If you ever have questions, go to the Shadow Priest Discord. There are tons of smart people there who are intimately familiar with the sim and can tell you what the absolute bis is. But this is always a really good starting point. Now let's talk about gems, enchants, and consumables. The enchants and consumables you see on the screen are pretty much always going to be the best option. Now, especially at the beginning of the expansion, these are going to be really expensive because Maelstrom crystals are hard to get. As the expansion goes on, as this tier goes on and more people are disenchanting their epics, those prices will come down and it will be a lot easier to get these enchants. There are alternatives you can use, but know that you're going to be sacrificing DPS in order to save gold. So you need to figure out what that balance is. If you have questions about which enchants are worse, sim it. Other people can answer it for you, but you should really learn how to sim it. Okay, now let's talk about gems and how your socket bonuses are going to work. For the most part, if a socket bonus gives you intellect, you're going to want to gem for that color. Now, when it comes to socket bonuses that have secondary stats, so that would be Spirit, Mastery, Haste, or Crit, you probably want to sim it to see whether you want to put in a gem to match that socket, or if you just want to put in an intellect gem. Now, this can get a little bit tricky because, for instance, if a socket bonus gives you plus 10 Spirit and you gem for it, if you're already hit capped, then that Spirit is worthless, which means you would need to reforge to realize the true value of that socket bonus. So you could replace the gem, go to Reforge Light, and reforge your gears for the appropriate stats. But that can be a little bit tedious. At least in tier 11, I think I would just recommend if the socket bonus gives plus intellect, then socket for it. If the socket bonus doesn't give plus intellect, then just use red gems in the sockets. Now on the screen are the gems that you want to use. If it's a red socket, then you want to use a Brilliant Inferno Ruby. If it's blue, you want to use a Purified Demon's Eye. And if it's yellow, you want to use a Reckless Ember Topaz. And your meta gem is going to be a Chaotic Shadow Spirit Diamond. And for this meta gem to be activated, you need at least 3 red gems. And guess what? All 3 of the gems I just listed count as red because the Reckless Ember Topaz is orange, so that's red and yellow. Purified Demon's Eye is purple, so that's red and blue. And Brilliant Inferno Ruby is obviously red. When in doubt about a socket bonus, just sim it. The sim, again, is the best tool you can use to find different comparisons on gear. I know I probably sound like a broken record telling you to sim it, but I promise that once you learn how to use the sim, it will make your life so much easier. Okay, now let's talk about professions. When it comes to professions, engineering and tailoring are going to be your best from a pure damage perspective. Engineering also provides you with Rocket Belt, which is a really nice quality of life, especially if you're not playing a class with a movement speed ratio. This is going to be really nice to move, although it can fail, which is going to be really annoying when it does happen. But from a pure DPS perspective, these are the professions that you want. Note that all professions are really good, so you're not losing a ton of damage by picking something else, but you're not going to be fully optimal either. Now, one thing to note is that jewel crafting is stronger now than it will be in the future. That's because right now we only have rare gems to socket our gear with. But in the next patch in Firelands, we will get epic gems, which means the difference between the gems that people can use in their gear versus the jewel crafting gems only gets smaller because the jewel crafting gems do not get stronger in future patches. So jewel crafting will be stronger now than it is in the future, though obviously it is still worse than tailoring and engineering. Okay, now let's talk about the rotation, shadow orbs, and haste breakpoints. Shadow Orbs are a new part of Shadow Priest in Cataclysm, and honestly, they really suck, at least in my opinion. That's because they have an 18% chance to be generated from your Shadow Word Pain and Mind Flayed damage, and you need them to be generated in order to start your rotation, in order to really do damage from it. Now, why are Shadow Orbs important? That's because when you have a Shadow Orb on your character, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 doesn't matter as long as you have at least one. If you cast Mind Blast or Mind Spike, you will get a buff on your character called Empowered Shadows. This is your mastery, essentially. This is going to increase the damage of your damage over time spells by a large amount. I think right now I have around 30% from my mastery in pre-raid gear. So what this means is until I can get a Shadow Orb and cast Mind Blast or Mind Spike, I'm missing out on 30% periodic spell damage. That really sucks. So our number one priority is going to be get a Shadow Orb. Now, hopefully it doesn't take too long, but RNG can really screw you over. So if you don't get a Shadow Orb, your rotation looks like this. Mind Spike on the pre-pull, into Shadow Fiend, into Shadow Word Pain, into 2 fully channeled Mind Flays, into Vampiric Touch followed by Devouring Plague, and then back to Mind Flay trying to spam for a Shadow Orb. If you do get a Shadow Orb on one of your first 2 Mind Flays, then you want to cast Mind Blast immediately and then apply Vampiric Touch and Devouring Plague and follow the normal priority. This is the same thing that happens if you have a Shadow Orb going into the start of a fight. Your precast is going to be Mind Spike, and then you just apply your dots as you normally would. Your normal cast priority is going to be maintain your dots on the target, followed by Mind Blast, followed by Shadow Fiend, followed by Shadow or Death if the target is under 25% HP, followed by Mind Flay as your filler. Note that if you cast Mind Spike and immediately follow it with a Shadow Word Pain, your Mind Spike will get rid of your Shadow Word Pain since it removes dots. Due to some weird thing with spell travel time, your Mind Spike is going to land after your Shadow Word Pain, which means you don't want to have those 2 spells cast in succession. Now, when you get into your actual rotation, after you cast a Mind Blast with a Shadow Orb and you have the Empowered Shadows buff, you will then be able to cast Mind Blast twice before that falls off. So you want to cast Mind Blast on cooldown after you just casted a Mind Blast that refreshed your Empowered Shadows buff. So even if you don't get a Shadow Orb immediately, you still want to cast that first Mind Blast on cooldown. But then you would want to wait for that second Mind Blast to make sure that you have a Shadow Orb available so that you can refresh your Empowered Shadows buff. As long as you refresh Empowered Shadows before you have to refresh your dots, then this is perfectly fine. If you want to be really safe, then you can always wait for a Shadow Orb before casting Mind Blast, but that is going to lower your DPS overall. Now let's talk about Archangel. So when you use Archangel, it's going to do two things. It's going to restore some of your mana, and it's going to increase the damage of your single target spells. So that's Mind Flay, Mind Blast, and Shadow Word Death. Now, after you cast your first Mind Blast with a Shadow Orb, you then want to wait for your next Mind Blast to come off cooldown. Once that happens is when you will use Archangel in your opener. Our goal is to get 3 casts of Mind Blasts within our Archangel window. So you wait for that second Mind Blast in your opener and you pop Archangel just before casting it. Now, one final thing to talk about for our rotation is Snapshotting DoTs. Now, snapshotting means that when you cast Vampiric Touch or Devouring Plague, whatever buffs are on your character are going to be the buffs that are applied to the dot when you cast it. Which means if you cast a dot without the Empowered Shadows buff, so you're missing probably around 30% dot damage, if not more, then when you do get Empowered Shadows, none of your dots will actually have that applied until you recast them, except for Shadow Word Pain, which gets all of its stats updated through Mind Flay Refresh. Now, this means in the Bad Luck opener, your dots are going to be applied to the target without the Empowered Shadows buff. But unfortunately, math is still being done to try to figure out if we want to recast our dots when we get Empowered Shadows, or if we cast it before Bloodlust goes out, and then do we want to recast our dots with Bloodlust? I'm sorry, I can't give you an answer because the smart people over at the Shadow Priest Discord are still working on this because it's a complicated answer. The one time I can tell you that you definitely want to reapply dots is when you get a Giga buff on your character. So this would be the buff that you get from Heroic Nefarian after you get Mind Control. That's 150% damage increase on your character, and that's going to be massive for reapplying your dots. Otherwise, sit tight, hopefully have an answer for you soon, and I will put it as a pinned comment once we do. Alright, now let's take a look at this rotation in a real fight. This is from my point of view, and you can see all of my casts on the right side of the screen. And if the video is too fast for you, then don't forget that YouTube allows you to slow the video down. Let's hop into it. Now when it comes to AoE, and this is mostly for dungeons, but does have some use in raids as well, note that Mindseer benefits from the Empowered Shadows buff as well. So anytime you're going from pack to pack in a dungeon, you want to make sure you have a Shadow Orb at the ready so that you Mind Blast into Mindseer. Or if you're doing a fight like Maloriak, where you're going to need to AoE a bunch of adds, that you're saving a Shadow Orb for just before those adds spawn or just before they're all grouped up so that you can Mind Blast and then AoE them all down with a really juiced up Mindseer. Okay, now let's talk about Haste Breakpoints. These are really important, but also not important at all, and let me explain why. The way haste works with dots specifically in Cataclysm is that the duration of your dot is no longer continually reduced by the amount of haste you have. Instead, it remains relatively close to its base duration, no matter how much haste you have. But the rate at which the ticks happen, the periodic damage happen, is increased with every piece of haste you have. And what this means is once you get enough haste, you will eventually be adding additional ticks into that base duration of your dot. Now, why does this matter, but also why does it not matter? It matters because from a pure, just single cast perspective, the more haste you have, the more damage a single cast will do, because not only will your ticks happen faster, but you will get more ticks in a single cast of Vampiric Touch. That's really good, and it's really nice to have more damage per a single cast. But why doesn't it matter? And what I want to stress when I say it doesn't matter is that people think that, oh, you reached a haste breakpoint, now we stop gearing haste. That's not true at all. Haste is important for a multitude of reasons. It also reduces the cast time of your spells, which is really important for Mind Flay, because the faster your Mind Flay ticks, the higher your Shadow Orb generation is going to be. And it means our dots just tick faster. So even if you're not getting an extra tick by adding more haste, it's still making your dots deal damage faster, which is always going to be important because dots are a large portion of our damage. So the general rule is you pretty much want all of the haste you can get. And remember, just sim your gear. There might be points when mastery or crit goes above haste, so just make sure that you understand how your stat weights can change as you get more gear, and that it's a general rule of thumb that haste is king, but it might not always be. Now, the one final thing to talk about the rotation and haste breakpoints is pandemic timing. What pandemic timing means is that no longer do you have to wait for a dot to fall off before you reapply it. Pandemic timing means that before your final tick occurs, you have this small window where you can refresh a dot, and that final tick is going to get added on to your next cast. So you want to overwrite it completely. Now, the window for this gets increasingly smaller as you get more haste because it's only that final tick of damage. So I guess to visualize this for you, if your Vampiric Touch is ticking every 2 seconds, then the final 2 seconds is your pandemic window. That's going to be the time between your second to last tick and your final tick because the dot is going to fall off the target after that final tick, which means you have 2 seconds in between the second to last tick and the final tick where you can refresh Vampiric Touch, and that final tick will just get added on to the next cast. So you'll have an extra tick of damage in that cast because it's adding in the tick from the previous cast. Now, this is the primary reason why the breakpoints don't really matter that much, because if you're timing your dots appropriately, then you're not really missing out on any damage other than the increased tick period that comes with haste. It doesn't matter that you're close to a haste breakpoint, that as long as you continually chain your dots together, it's basically like you have one very long continuous dot that's never breaking in its damage pattern. Now, this is going to be really hard as fights get more complex and more mechanics are introduced, but on a pure single target fight, the haste breakpoints almost have no relevance whatsoever if you're just standing still and DPSing the boss. Now again, this is something that is a lot easier in theory than in practice. But if you continually work to improve the timing of your dots, then you will just get better and better at doing this. Okay, now let's talk about some add-ons that make this class a lot easier to play. Number one, you need a nameplate add-on. I love using Plater. I've used this for years. I've used it in retail, I've used it in Classic, I've used it in Season of Discovery. I think having your nameplates, for me, as my primary form of tracking dots on my targets, is the best way to go. Other people like having their dots be displayed by a Weakora. I primarily love using my nameplates. I just think it makes it really easy to see, especially with the 40 yards range of the nameplates that we have in Cataclysm Classic. This is my primary method of tracking dots, especially on multiple targets. Obviously, Weakauras is going to be huge, whether you're using it to have a little Shadow Priest user interface like I have on my screen here, or if you're using it for boss timers and trackers. There's just so many things that you can do with Weakauras that if you're not using it, you're really hampering your ability to play the game. A cast bar is also going to be important. I use the add-on Quartz for mine, but there are some really great Weakauras that are actually a cast bar as well. The Dragon Karsh cast bar that I've linked in the video description is really good because it's going to show your Mind Flay ticks and it's going to show you your latency on your casts. Now, if you use the fake Q Weakaura made by Heavyside, this is going to be really, really helpful because Dragon Karsh's Weakaura cast bar will give you a window where you can recast your Mind Flay, and Heavyside's fake Q Weakaura will then essentially freeze your game, even though it's barely noticeable at this point, but it will freeze your game so that your next Mind Flay cast goes off after your next tick of Mind Flay occurs. So I would recommend using these two Weakauras together if you're going to do so. And finally, let's talk about races. If you're Alliance, you want to be a Worgen or a Draenei. Worgen is just going to be best, especially with Darkflight, and then Draenei gives the next best bonus after that with 1% hit. After that, it would be Human, followed by Dwarf, followed by Gnome. If you're Horde, you want to be Troll or Goblin, but Troll is going to be better more consistently from a pure damage perspective. Berserking is just such a strong racial that it's impossible to ignore how good it is. Rocket Jump from Goblin is also really good. It doesn't increase your DPS, but it allows you to move a lot faster than you otherwise would on a 1.5 minute cooldown. So if your primary focus is progression rating, then I would recommend Goblin over Troll, but if you care about parsing in the middle of the tier and trying to get those 99s and 100s, then you definitely want to go Troll. If you're not picking one of those two, then it doesn't really matter, just pick whatever class you want, whether that's Tauren, Undead, or Blood Elf. And that's it for this guide, so I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give a like and subscribe, as I really appreciate it and it helps me out a lot. Anyway, my name is Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.